The typical experience for a U.S. worker is one of persistent financial distress. The gnawing feeling that you won't be able to make your rent payment at the end of the month. The gnawing feeling that there's a pile of bills and you can't pay them all. The gnawing feeling that your credit card debt is really undermining the quality of life because you're paying 22% interest. Or even worse, a payday loan where you're paying 300% interest on an annualized basis. The fact that such an enormous fraction of the workforce is living in financial distress, I think is a grave social problem. And I think a lot of people that find themselves in positions of leadership aren't experiencing that, especially people that are very successful financially. They're not experiencing that at all. And I worry that we've built a system that works well for those who are financially sophisticated and financially knowledgeable and ultimately economically successful,
well
but one
paid.
that isn't working for so many people who sit down at night and have that pit in their stomach because they see the pile of bills and then they open up their bank statement and there's a disconnect. And I think we can do a lot more to help households navigate that tension.
Meet over half of the working world. They are the machine that powers our society, from making your coffee and emptying your garbage to caring for your relatives and delivering your parcels. You might see them as frontline or essential workers, or you might not see them at all. The Invisible Worker podcast explores the financial landscape of our most diligent workforce. We speak to experts in mobility, inclusion, policy, research, and more to find out where the problems are and how we can start to fix them. My name is Emily and I host the Invisible Worker podcast, brought to you by Stream, the world's leading financial wellbeing provider. I'm here today with Professor David Laibson, the Robert I. Goldman Professor of Economics at Harvard University. David, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
David, you had about 100 other titles, but I thought I would trim it to be succinct.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for joining me. You have spent the last several decades researching savings, wealth, self-regulation, behavior change, household finance, public finance, many other things. I found evidence of at least 100 published papers with your name on them. So it's fair to say you're a bit of an expert.
I've been around a long time.
You've been around a long time. That makes you an expert,
That
right?
makes me an expert.
Lived experience. And you've been teaching at Harvard since 1994, so more than 30 years. The way that we work and earn has changed a lot in the last 30 years, and actually an accelerating pace of change in the last few years. From all of your research and everything that you've looked at over these decades, what else needs to change so that people have a good chance of reaching an adequate income in retirement?
So it varies by country.
Okay.
Are we talking about the US? Are we talking about other places in the world? Every country has its own limitations with respect to these systems. The US is doing an especially bad job with respect to getting workers ready for retirement. And that is a reflection of a sort of anti-paternalistic philosophy, which by and large leaves people with more freedom in this country than in other countries. Think about Singapore and Australia maybe as the opposite extreme, especially Singapore. Here in the US, you don't have to save for retirement outside of Social Security. And then the primary way that US workers save for retirement is in the modern 401k plan, but that's not illiquid. When you separate employers, you can withdraw your balances and pay only a 10% penalty, or depending upon the withdrawal reason, no penalty. And a lot of workers do withdraw their balances as they migrate from employer to employer. As a consequence, the median US worker arrives at retirement with $25,000 in all of their retirement accounts added together. So essentially, the only real savings they've done is through the forced savings of our Social Security system. And that, as you know, is not nearly enough to maintain their quality of living between their working life and retirement. And so there's going to be, for most workers, a step down.
So would you say that there needs to be a trade-off and that Americans need to give up some of their freedom and flexibility to have financial security?
It's a great question and one that I've spent decades mulling over. I don't think we have a very sharp answer. I'll tell you what my instincts are after these 30 years of work. I do think that we should have some more forced savings in the US.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example of how that might work. We could say that in your 401k contribution, the money that is your own contribution could be still permissible for withdrawals decades before retirement.
Yeah.
But the money that is going into those accounts as employer matching dollars, maybe we should say that those are locked in until you reach disability or retirement. Now, I might add that that's the norm the world over. Only the US and Canada have a system where you can take out your contributions long before you get to retirement in a DC system. Everywhere else, essentially, they're locked in until you retire. So I would tilt us a bit more towards the way the rest of the world has organized things, though I will admit that there are benefits to being able to withdraw early. If you have a financial crisis and you're 50 years old, there's that money ready to be deployed.
Yeah.
The problem is it's not then ready when you're 70 and retired. And consequently, a lot of households retire with inadequate resources for the long run.
And that's the trade-off. If you're 50 and have a crisis, accessing that retirement fund is better than a very expensive form of debt, for example, but potentially harms you down the line.
Yeah, though there's even a better thing to do, which is if we could get people to be saving continuously, both for the long run, retirement, and the short run, a rainy day account, then we would have our cake and eat it too, because there'd be some funds ready for retirement and other funds ready for a roof repair at age 50 or a car repair, whatever it is that's the big financial shock for someone who's in midlife. And so our problem is that we need to save for two major financial events.
Yeah.
One is the long run retirement problem that we face, and the other is the kind of medium run major expense problem that we face too, and we need to make progress on both fronts.
Okay, this is interesting because one of your research focus areas is behavior change and self-regulation. So taking that and running with it, what have you learned about the way people behave, and how do we build systems that account for it? So how do we help people to make the choices they want to make, but perhaps struggle to make given the systems they operate in?
So one of the big themes of the work I've done is that people generally have good intentions about all these things that we're talking about today, but have a hard time getting around to executing. And so it would be great if our systems automatically set people up for success. They could opt out maybe from those automatic systems, but by and large, people do want to save for the short run, for the medium run, for the long run. And we could facilitate that by creating various accounts that receive funds from their paycheck for these different horizons. And maybe the short run accounts are liquid and the long run accounts are much less liquid or completely illiquid, at least some of those dollars in the long run accounts. We could do more to facilitate all of these appropriate savings vehicles because people have a hard time navigating on their own. They're busy, it's confusing, the financial landscape is very complex. We could do more to make it easy for people, more on autopilot to get things right.
We've also seen that people don't perceive themselves to be savers until they start saving. So there's a big psychological hurdle to get over, which we've taken some of your research and worked together on automatic enrollment into short-term savings. And the number one piece of qualitative feedback is, I didn't think I could do it. I didn't think I was a saver. So there's a big emotional and psychological hurdle to get over as well for people.
Absolutely. It's very hard. The financial landscape is complicated, and getting signed up, figuring out which provider to choose, getting the account set up, doing the paperwork, going through paperwork, the online enrollments, all of the different elements, there are hurdles. And in a world where I'm busy today, I can do it tomorrow, which is a major part of what I study, the kind of self-control question of perpetually postponing that 2 hours of hard work, lead us often to take years to get our financial house in order. And that's why these systems, if they're set up correctly, can dramatically improve people's readiness for both the short-run challenges they'll face financially and of course the long run challenges.
I'm always interested in that self-control question because it applies in other facets of life as well. So if you ask somebody to pre-order their menu, for example, they might pick a healthy option for themselves. It's like future Emily can have the salad, but Emily in the moment wants the cheese board, right?
Absolutely.
And so like I can make a good choice for myself ahead of time, not really understanding that I'm going to walk in those shoes in a couple of weeks and have to eat that salad I picked for myself.
Well, maybe you do understand you're going to have to eat it, and that will work out well. The problem is often someone comes to us at the last second and says, by the way, we have the triple whammy ice cream dessert. Would you like one?
Yeah.
And even though earlier that day I said, I'm going to try to eat well today, when that fantastic dessert is offered to me at the right moment of the meal, easy pickings.
It's hard to say no.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm guilty of all of these contradictions myself. I'm the perfect example of someone who makes wonderful resolutions and carries out none of them.
Oh, we all are. And I read this really interesting data point that came out of the UK Pensions Commission, who actually used your work to design the UK pension system today. But the data point they looked at, and they concluded that 0.5% of the population behave in a way that's economically rational, and that 99.5% of us do not do the things we should do. And I do it too. I overpay my mortgage because I don't like the feeling of having a big debt, even though I'd be much more efficient putting that money into investments. But it's emotional, it's not rational. And I think that is how we function. We are people, we are emotional beings.
It's impossible to be economically rational. The world's too complicated, and our instincts are too poorly aligned with that long run view.
I want to know who those 0.5% are. I'd like to meet one of them and understand how they think about the world.
Some of them. They're
okay.
all economists. It's a handful of economists.
Okay.
And indeed, most economists don't behave rationally, but a tiny fraction of the economists do. I'm not one of them.
You're not one of them. All right. Well, that's kind of reassuring. And so coming back to your work, your research that you did quite some years ago on this concept of automatic enrollment, it was the answer for the UK, right? The UK was struggling with this pension crisis of people are undersaving, and they'd looked at Australia, who was mandating enrollment. You had no choice. And they looked at the current system, which was asking people to choose, and they tested education and all sorts of interventions. And then they found your work, and they went, aha, that's it. And they ran with it, and they rolled this out with not a lot of additional research in the UK. They just took it and they made that the answer. And it's been enormously successful. It's taken pension participation from around 30% of private sector to above 80%. Tens of millions of people are saving or have saved for retirement because of your work. In those last 30 years that you've been working, is there anything else in your research, in your archives or your current work that has the same impact or the same potential impact? Because that was a big one. That was life-changing for millions of people.
Yeah. So there's been lots of other ideas of stimulating good decision making that has also had a big impact, though not the impact of auto-enrollment, which I worked on with Bridget Madrian, James Choi, John Bashairs.
Yeah.
So a lot of us contributed to those papers. The other idea that I think has had a very substantial impact, but not nearly as big as auto-enrollment, is asking people to make a decision. Sometimes it's called active choice.
Yeah.
And often in life, we're just so busy and distracted that we just rush through things and we let the default become our decision by default. And often the default's very bad. Sometimes if you slow people down and you ask them to stop and make a decision, do you want A or do you want B? They'll actually, if they're forced to pause, make a choice that's good for them. And so I think that's another thing that we should think about very frequently as we design the decision-making architecture that we're interacting with. Sometimes you want to give people an automatic choice. Sometimes you want to force them to make a choice.
Yeah.
And that active choice approach has been used in many different domains. It's actually often, I think, used maliciously by firms stopping people and scaring people into making a choice, the wrong choice. Maybe it's by buying extremely overpriced insurance for travel or something like that.
I was just thinking of that, yeah.
So I see the world deploying a lot of the ideas that we developed, often for good, often not for good. So I'm nervous about the ways in which these ideas migrate out into the world. But active choice is another thing that we should often think about for good and try to avoid using for bad, though certainly both are out there these days.
Yeah.
Another thing that I think is enormously important that came out of this work is the idea of reducing the activation energy for making decisions. One of the things that makes it so difficult for people to go ahead and do the things that they want to do anyway is they feel as though there's this big hurdle of getting it done. 2 hours of research or days of research. I can't make the right decision. It's so complicated. So often we can make the decision-making process much easier. We can shrink the costs involved, the time involved. We can turn 50 pages of fine print into 1 page of 13-point font. So we should all be thinking about how we give people choices and how we turn choices that are complicated and hence prone to procrastination into choices that are easier and hence prone to actually getting made, executed, done. That's another important area, and I think that's just about lowering the barriers to making decisions by making decision-making easier.
That feels like another trade-off almost in that kind of freedom security example, in that a lot of decisions are complicated because they operate in regulated industries. When we're talking about financial decisions, where there is an amount of information that needs to be displayed to you, or certain hoops you are required to jump through, some positive friction. So we spoke earlier about the example of moving your pension, right? There's a necessary amount of friction to that. So you don't want to make it too easy, right?
So it depends upon the context.
Okay.
I like to have regulators often think about safe harbor decisions where you want to create an environment where there's a good decision. It's been pre-endorsed by someone who's been very thoughtful, a regulator, hopefully unbiased, not corrupt. And you can enable people to make these safe harbor choices very quickly. Indeed, auto-enrollment is typically into some kind of safe harbor arrangement with respect to, let's say, asset allocation.
Yeah.
You can't auto-enroll people into holding a crypto portfolio.
No, you cannot.
So just as you auto-enroll people into holding diversified securities with low fees, you could also create other simplified choices that help people choose correct asset allocation with diversification, with low fees. And so you're absolutely right. Often you need to give people the information, but that's when the setting is something that's complicated and maybe not so good for them. But when it's something that's good for them, and we all agree, the regulator, the experts, then often we don't need 50 pages of fine print, which ends up being a huge hurdle to getting it done. People can simply check a box and go forward because what they're agreeing to is a safe harbor.
Yeah, and let's be real, no one reads the 50 pages of fine print.
Just becomes a reason to put the piece of paper aside and get to it later, and it never happens.
Yeah, gotcha. All right. Based on everything that you've learned about people, behavior, household finances, and more, where does responsibility sit for ensuring that people have access to adequate financial resources, both now and in their retirement? Is it individual? Is it at the state level? Is it employer? Who owns that, or who should own that?
Yeah, so in an ideal world, these are such complicated decisions that I think telling a 23-year-old worker who's just joined the labor force, by the way, you've got to figure out what's going to happen vis-a-vis retirement saving that will not play out for 50 years.
Yeah.
I think that's unrealistic. We just don't have that capacity. We're not all open heart surgeons. We delegate that to a physician. We're also not all brilliant investors. We should be essentially putting someone else in the catbird seat, the decision-making role. So I would say that in an ideal world, governments would say, we have a policy for requiring that workers be auto-enrolled, requiring that they be auto-enrolled into appropriate investments, low fees, diversified, an appropriate equity component, and it maybe translates or transitions appropriately to a less risky portfolio as you get older. I would say that governments are the natural actors to create all of that infrastructure and to create the regulatory oversight and to make sure it operates appropriately. But if governments aren't going to do it, then employers might be doing it.
Right.
But if employers don't do it, then I don't have a whole lot of confidence that the vast majority of workers are going to get that right because of the complexity of these decisions. And so while in many places in the world it is left up to the worker, I think that's a formula for failure for most households. Granted, there'll be a small group that gets it exactly right and does really well, but that kind of financial sophistication is not sufficiently widespread that we can count on the household sector to broadly make those decisions without assistance.
I think if you look at it mathematically as well, you have to ask yourself who bears the cost of getting that wrong. And in a country where there is adequate social security, it's the government, therefore the taxpayer, therefore to an extent the employers. You can kind of make an argument for any of those groups requiring appropriate regulation, policy, rule, what have you, because they ultimately bear the cost if they fail.
Bear part of the cost. I mean, a big part of the cost is just someone who ended up living well beyond their means at age 50 and then ends up having a life that is financially very distressed at age 75 or 80. And so while it's true the state will be on the hook a little bit to take care of that 80-year-old, most of the harm is the individual themselves having spent money frivolously at age 50 and then facing a pretty mean and difficult existence at age 80. And yes, the government will be subsidizing their financial circumstances at age 80, but to a great extent, it's the individual themselves that are bearing this cost of having a life that money was wasted early and then money was desperately needed later and it wasn't available. And sometimes that ends up being a burden on one's children or other family members that step in. So I do think that there's an element of paternalism here where we're saying, hey, we can foresee that this is going to go sideways for you, dear worker, at age 30. And that's why we're not necessarily doing this to save the government money. Sure, that's part of it. But we're doing this because we want to make sure that you don't end up making mistakes that make your 30-year-old self happy because you're living the high life, but make your 80-year-old self miserable because you can't, let's say, get the home health care that you need. And as a consequence, the public provided health care, which is not nearly what you could have afforded, is going to be what you're left with.
Yeah. And again, most of us aren't good at predicting our future selves. And we all like to imagine that we won't need care, but most of us will.
That's right.
Right. That got dark pretty fast.
Sorry. Yeah. The robots will save us. I'm sure the robots will provide lower cost care.
There we go. The AI robots. They're coming for us and everything will be fine. I always ask one question to everybody who comes on the podcast. This is about the invisible worker, the financial landscape of the working majority. What is one thing you've learned about this worker or their financial circumstances that you wish more people knew?
I think the typical experience for a U.S. worker is one of persistent financial distress. The gnawing feeling that you won't be able to make your rent payment at the end of the month. The gnawing feeling that there's a pile of bills and you can't pay them all. The gnawing feeling that your credit card debt is really undermining the quality of life because you're paying 22% interest. Or even worse, a payday loan where you're paying 300% interest on an annualized basis. The fact that such an enormous fraction of the workforce is living in financial distress, I think is a grave social problem. And I think a lot of people that find themselves in positions of leadership aren't experiencing that, especially people that are very successful financially. They're not experiencing that at all. And I worry that we've built a system that works well for those who are financially sophisticated and financially knowledgeable and ultimately economically successful,
well
but one
paid.
that isn't working for so many people who sit down at night and have that pit in their stomach because they see the pile of bills and then they open up their bank statement and there's a disconnect. And I think we can do a lot more to help households navigate that tension.
We can do a lot more. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Professor David Laibson. Before you go, make sure you stay in touch. Please subscribe to the Invisible Worker podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you go to listen. That way you can follow along as we release new episodes. Thanks again, and see you soon.